January 1944. Somewhere outside Cherbourg, France, a German medical officer named Dr. Karl Brenner crouched in a muddy field hospital. Around him, the wounded groaned beneath flickering lanterns. A soldier's leg was swollen twice its size, infected from a shrapnel wound that had festered for days. Brenner had seen it 1,000 times before. He cleaned the wound with alcohol, dusted it with sulfa powder, and prayed it would hold. It rarely did. Infection meant fever. Fever meant death. When the morphine ran out, he sat in silence beside his patients, watching the light fade from their eyes. War had taught him medicine's limits. No amount of training could stop gangrene. No antiseptic could beat nature's slow, cruel decay. He wrote in his journal that night, "We can replace limbs, not lives. Our science ends where infection begins." That same winter, on the other side of the English Channel, American medical units were unloading crates marked with strange labels. Penicillin, keep refrigerated. The drug was still experimental, its production tightly guarded. Developed by British scientists, refined by American chemists, it was the first true antibiotic, a medicine that didn't just clean wounds, but killed the bacteria inside them. To the Allies, penicillin was a miracle. To the Axis, it was myth. Rumors of its power had reached German doctors through whispers. A mold serum that could cure infections thought hopeless. Nazi scientists tried desperately to replicate it, but they failed. They lacked the industrial equipment, the fermentation process, and the American factories that could produce it in mass quantities. So, while Allied soldiers survived wounds that once meant certain death, German soldiers continued to die from infections that no amount of skill or faith could cure. By the summer of 1944, that difference had become visible even on the battlefield. Captured German medics began noticing Allied wounded healing faster, men returning to duty within days of being shot. When asked what treatment they were using, American doctors simply smiled and said, "Good nursing and a bit of luck." The truth was far more astonishing. Fast forward to May 1945, the war was over. The Third Reich had fallen, and thousands of German officers, scientists, and doctors were now prisoners of the Allied powers. Among them was Dr. Brenner. He had surrendered near Hamburg, carrying a medical bag, a stethoscope, and a single worn notebook. He expected interrogation, maybe imprisonment, maybe worse. Instead, he was sent to a POW camp in England that doubled as a medical exchange center for captured military doctors. There, the Allies had an unusual approach. Rather than humiliate their captives, they educated them. They showed them new surgical techniques, modern sterilization methods, and, eventually, something Brenner had only heard about in passing: penicillin. The first time he saw it, it was under glass, a tiny vial filled with pale yellow liquid. The American physician holding it smiled proudly. "This," he said, "has saved more lives in 2 years than all of our surgeons combined." Brenner scoffed at first. "How can a mold do what chemistry cannot?" "Because," the doctor replied, "this mold doesn't clean the wound, it kills the cause." To prove it, they showed him a case file, a young American soldier with a deep abdominal wound. By every known medical law, the man should have died of sepsis. But after a few doses of the new drug, the fever broke. Within days, the infection vanished. He lived. Brenner stared at the chart for minutes, silent. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled. "If we had this," he said softly, "my hospital in Normandy would still be full of men who are now buried." For captured German doctors, that realization was more devastating than defeat itself. They had prided themselves on being heirs to the world's finest medical tradition, the land of Koch, Ehrlich, and Virchow. Yet here they stood, astonished by a discovery they had dismissed as rumor. Some broke down in tears. Others begged for literature, data, anything that could explain how it worked. American doctors obliged. teaching them the basics of antibiotic therapy, how a naturally occurring fungus, Penicillium notatum, secreted a compound that destroyed bacterial cell walls without harming human tissue. It was biology turned into salvation. That night, Brenner wrote a new entry in his journal. "We fought a war believing in steel and blood, but they won with science. A fungus defeated our empire." He didn't mean it metaphorically. He meant it literally. The next day, he asked permission to observe penicillin production. What he saw there, the rows of fermenters, the industrial precision, the collaboration between scientists and soldiers, would alter not just his understanding of medicine, but his faith in what humanity could be when it stopped destroying itself. Summer, 1945. The war was over, but in England and America, the war against infection had just begun. Long before the atomic bomb or the jet engine, the Allies had unveiled a quieter weapon, one that saved rather than destroyed. And, for the captured German doctors, its power was more humbling than anything they had seen on the battlefield. In a converted factory outside London, Dr. Karl Brenner stood before what looked like a brewery. Rows of metal vats stretching into the distance, pipes hissing with steam, the air thick with the scent of yeast. It was here, Allied scientists explained, that penicillin was born. Each vat was alive, a living culture of Penicillium chrysogenum, carefully fed and monitored. Through weeks of controlled fermentation, the mold secreted its golden elixir into the broth, which was then filtered, purified, and crystallized into the world's first true antibiotic. Brenner had studied bacteriology before the war, but this was something else entirely. Medicine turned into an industry. The Americans had achieved what German science, despite all its brilliance, could not: mass production of a miracle. He had heard rumors during the war that the Allies had found a wonder drug, that amputations had fallen by 90%, that soldiers once doomed by infection were walking again within days. The Nazi medical corps had scoffed. They tried to replicate it in secret laboratories, growing mold in beer bottles and bread loaves, but their efforts produced only impurities. The drug's secret wasn't chemistry, it was engineering. They lacked the massive fermentation tanks, the deep freeze storage, the chemical purification systems the Allies had built across America. What Brenner saw in London made that difference painfully clear. Here was science serving life, not ideology. Teams of men and women, British, American, Canadian, working side by side in spotless white coats, measuring, recording, refining. No rank, no insignia, only collaboration. A British doctor turned to him and said, "We didn't do this to win a war. We did it so there wouldn't be another one." For Brenner and his fellow German physicians, that struck deeper than any interrogation could. During the war, they had been taught that medicine existed to serve the Reich, to keep soldiers fighting, to test endurance, to separate the strong from the weak. But here, medicine served humanity. It healed without asking what uniform you wore. He watched in silence as a young nurse drew a syringe from a chilled vial labeled Penicillin G sodium. The fluid glowed faintly under the light. It looked so ordinary, yet it represented a leap greater than any tank or rocket his nation had built. Later that week, the POW doctors were allowed to tour an Allied hospital ward reserved for wounded soldiers, men from both sides of the war. There, Brenner saw something that left him speechless. On one bed lay an American infantryman with a shattered leg. On the next lay a German prisoner, wounded during the retreat from the Ardennes. Both were being treated with the same drug, by the same hands. The British physician guiding them explained casually, "Infection doesn't choose sides. Neither should medicine." Brenner stared at the German soldier, his own countryman, alive and recovering because of Allied penicillin. The irony was unbearable. The same enemy he'd been taught to hate had saved one of his own men. That night, He couldn't sleep. He wrote in his journal under candlelight. In Berlin, we built laboratories to purify races. In London, they built laboratories to purify life. I have never felt so small. As weeks passed, the Germans were given lectures by Allied medical officers on the drug's discovery. They learned the story, how a Scottish scientist named Alexander Fleming had noticed mold-killing bacteria on a petri dish in 1928, how British biochemists Florey and Chain revived the idea, and how American industry had turned it from a laboratory curiosity into a mass-produced weapon against death itself. To the German doctors, the timeline read like a rebuke of their own system. While the Nazis poured billions into rockets and nerve gas, the Allies had poured effort into saving lives. Dr. Otto Schreiber, a captured surgeon from Munich, whispered to Brenner after the lecture, "It's strange. We spent years perfecting how to destroy. They spent years perfecting how to heal." The irony was not lost on their captors either. Many British and American physicians admitted privately that the German medical establishment before Hitler had once been the gold standard of science, pioneers of microbiology, anesthesia, and surgery. But ideology had poisoned that legacy. Now, standing in Allied laboratories, those same German doctors realized how far they had fallen, not just militarily, but morally. They began to ask for textbooks, diagrams, and chemical samples. Some were permitted to help with experimental tests on laboratory animals, studying the effects of penicillin under supervision. For the first time since their capture, they worked not as prisoners, but as students. When one German bacteriologist successfully purified a sample of the drug under Allied guidance, he whispered, almost reverently, "This is what science was meant for." Brenner nodded, writing the words in his notebook. Not conquest, not ideology, but preservation. The transformation had begun. These men, once instruments of a fallen empire, were now witnesses to a new kind of power. Not one born of domination, but of compassion multiplied by knowledge. They were realizing, one lesson at a time, that the real victory of World War II wasn't military at all. It was medical. In every war before 1943, the deadliest enemy wasn't bullets or bombs. It was infection. From Napoleon's campaigns to the trenches of the First World War, more soldiers died from gangrene and sepsis than from combat wounds. It was a truth every military doctor knew too well. But in the Second World War, something extraordinary happened. A silent revolution that turned the tide of survival long before the battles were won. That revolution had a name: penicillin. By the time D-Day began, Allied field hospitals were carrying supplies of the drug in refrigerated cases, guarded almost like ammunition. A single vial could mean the difference between amputation and recovery. Doctors learned to recognize the infections it could conquer: Streptococcus, Staphylococcus, Clostridium. Each one, once a death sentence, was now vulnerable. British surgeons joked that penicillin did more to win the war than the Spitfire. They weren't exaggerating. In Normandy, medics watched soldiers who should have been lost to infection rise from their cots in days. Flesh wounds closed cleanly. Fractures mended without fever. The number of amputations in some units dropped by 80%. The miracle wasn't loud. It didn't roar like artillery or explode like bombs. It whispered, in healed wounds, steady heartbeats, and men who lived to fight again. German intelligence reports captured in late 1944 revealed how completely the Axis had misunderstood the scale of the discovery. They referred to it dismissively as an English serum of questionable stability. German laboratories had indeed tried to replicate it at IG Farben, Bayer, and the Robert Koch Institute. But the mold strains they used were weak. Their fermentation processes were primitive, producing only milligrams of impure material. A German biochemist wrote in frustration, "It seems to work in the petri dish, but not in the body. The British must be lying about its effectiveness." But they weren't lying. They had something the Reich never understood: collaboration. In the U.S., government scientists had partnered with private companies, Merck, Pfizer, Squibb, to turn penicillin into a mass-produced medicine. Fermenters originally built for beer were repurposed for mold cultivation. Chemists learned to extract and crystallize the active compound with unprecedented precision. By 1945, America was producing 650 billion units of penicillin per month. Germany, by comparison, produced almost none. For doctors like Karl Brenner, now sitting in a POW camp laboratory with Allied scientists, this realization was crushing. He understood now why German soldiers had continued dying of simple infections, while Allied troops recovered from wounds that would have been fatal just a year earlier. He remembered the young soldiers in Normandy, boys who'd begged for help as their legs blackened with gangrene. No matter how cleanly he amputated, the infection always returned. Sometimes it crawled up through the bloodstream until the heart gave out. He whispered to his captors, "If we had this drug, I could have saved them. All of them." The British officer beside him said gently, "That's why we're showing it to you, so no one has to lose another generation that way." By autumn of 1945, reports of penicillin's battlefield miracles had spread through every Allied camp. Surgeons who'd once performed amputations daily were suddenly idle. Field medics carried syringes of the golden liquid like sacred relics. Even cynics began to call it the second front against death. And when captured German doctors heard those stories, many refused to believe them until they saw the data themselves. Mortality rates from infected wounds had dropped from 12% to less than 1%. Soldiers who had been left for dead were walking again within a week. To a generation of doctors trained to fear infection as an unstoppable force, it felt like witnessing a resurrection. But beyond the numbers, something deeper was happening. Something Brenner couldn't stop thinking about. If the Allies could cure disease faster than Germany could create it, what did that say about the kind of world they were building? For the first time, he began to see war itself as a sickness, one that fed on ignorance and pride. Penicillin wasn't just a medicine. It was a metaphor, proof that healing could conquer destruction. At night, the captured doctors gathered around the barracks table discussing everything they'd seen. Some were skeptical, others were awed, but all of them agreed on one point. This drug had changed the future of medicine forever. Dr. Otto Schreiber turned to Brenner and said quietly, "Imagine if we had found this before the war. Imagine if the first miracle of the 20th century had been one that saved lives, not took them." Brenner nodded slowly. Then perhaps there would have been no war at all. Outside, the camp was quiet. Snow had begun to fall, soft, white, and silent, covering the scars of a world that had nearly destroyed itself. Inside, beneath the glow of a lantern, the German doctors kept studying the data, their breath visible in the cold. They weren't prisoners anymore, not really. They were witnesses to a transformation far greater than their defeat. They were watching the dawn of a new age, one where science would no longer serve conquest, but compassion. In the spring of 1945, as the guns of Europe fell silent, another kind of silence filled the Allied field hospitals, the quiet of recovery. Men who should have died weeks earlier were sitting up, talking, even smiling. The miracle drug had done its work. Penicillin wasn't just healing wounds, it was reshaping morality in the ashes of war. Because now, for the first time, doctors faced a question that no weapon could answer. Should the miracle be shared with the enemy? It began quietly in the prisoner wards, tents and makeshift hospitals filled with wounded German soldiers. Some were barely alive, their uniforms soaked in blood and mud, their bodies ravaged by infection. To the medics, They weren't enemies anymore. They were patients. The Allied doctors had no orders regarding penicillin use on POWs, but they didn't hesitate. To a true physician, the Hippocratic Oath came before flags. At a field hospital near Rouen, France, an American surgeon named Captain Robert Finch administered the first recorded doses of penicillin to captured German soldiers. Among them was a Luftwaffe pilot, whose leg had been crushed when his plane crashed during retreat. Finch's colleagues advised amputation, standard procedure for such injuries. But Finch had seen what penicillin could do. He injected the pilot twice a day for 3 days. By the end of the week, the swelling subsided, the fever broke, and the infection vanished. The pilot kept his leg. He wept. When the war ended, he wrote Finch a letter from his POW camp. "You saved me when I was your enemy. I can only hope someday our nations learn from you." These stories multiplied across Europe. British doctors in Normandy treated captured SS troops with the same care they gave their own wounded. American medics in Italy used their precious stockpiles to save German soldiers who had tried to kill them only days earlier. One nurse, Mary Hollis, later recalled, "We didn't think of them as Nazis anymore. They were just boys, scared, hurting, far from home, and penicillin didn't care who they were." The drug was doing more than curing disease. It was curing hate. When news of these actions reached London, some politicians objected. "Why waste the miracle drug on those who brought us war?" One MP argued in Parliament. But the medical corps stood firm. The British War Office quietly authorized penicillin use for all wounded under Allied care, regardless of nationality. That decision changed everything. In a war defined by cruelty, it became one of the first official acts of compassion. Even hardened veterans felt its moral weight. A U.S. Army surgeon wrote home, "I gave penicillin to a man who'd shot my best friend. He lived. I thought it would make me angry. Instead, I felt free." Dr. Karl Brenner heard these stories while still interned in England. They spread like whispers among the German POW doctors. At first, many didn't believe them. The idea that Americans would share such a precious resource with their captives seemed absurd. But soon, Allied medical officers began confirming it. One evening, an English doctor brought a box into the POW infirmary. Vials of penicillin, carefully labeled. He placed them on the table and said simply, "We have more than enough. Use it where it's needed." Brenner stared at the box for a long time. The words on the label, "Made in USA," felt like a message from another world. That night, he treated a fellow prisoner suffering from a severe wound infection. The man's temperature was 104 degrees, his pulse weak, his skin gray. Brenner administered the drug with trembling hands. By morning, the fever broke. It was the first time in his career he'd seen a dying man pulled back from the brink so completely. When word spread through the camp, the other German doctors crowded into the infirmary to witness the recovery. They stood silently as the patient, still pale but alive, whispered, "I thought I was done for. What did you give me?" Brenner hesitated. Then, almost reverently, he said, "Hope. From the other side." The effect on morale was immediate. The German prisoners, many of whom had lost faith in everything, their country, their cause, their future, began to feel something new: gratitude. For the Allied doctors, these moments carried their own weight. Healing the enemy was more than an act of mercy. It was a declaration that science belonged to no nation, no ideology. Penicillin had become the great equalizer, a bridge between former foes, built on compassion instead of conquest. Months later, when the POWs were repatriated to Germany, many of them carried with them small notebooks filled with handwritten notes and sketches. Chemical diagrams of the penicillin molecule, instructions for sterilization, dosages. They weren't souvenirs. They were seeds, seeds that, when planted in post-war Germany, would grow into a new generation of doctors determined to rebuild medicine not for the Reich, but for humanity. Brenner's final note in his prison journal captured that transformation. "We began this war believing strength was in steel. Now I see it lives in kindness, bottled in glass, delivered by hand." He didn't know it then, but the same drug he had just used to save one man would, in a few short years, save millions from infections, from pneumonia, from diseases once considered divine punishment. The mold from a London lab had done what no general could. It had ended a cycle of vengeance and reminded mankind of its oldest duty: to heal. By 1946, Europe was a continent of ruins, not just in its cities, but in its conscience. The war had burned through everything: hospitals, homes, faith. Tens of millions were dead, and the survivors carried scars that no medicine could erase. But in the middle of this devastation, a small vial of golden liquid began traveling farther than any tank ever had. Its name, penicillin. The Allies knew they couldn't rebuild nations through politics alone. They needed to rebuild trust, and the fastest way to do that was through healing. So, long before food aid and reconstruction funds arrived, crates of penicillin were shipped into the heart of broken Europe. It wasn't just a drug anymore. It was diplomacy in a syringe. In Germany, where disease outbreaks followed bombed-out water systems and overcrowded refugee camps, Allied medics worked side by side with former Wehrmacht doctors to fight infection. Typhus, pneumonia, syphilis, sepsis, all surged after the collapse of the Nazi health system. The hospitals that still stood had no heat, no power, and almost no medicine. When the first shipments of penicillin arrived in Frankfurt, the crowd that gathered outside the makeshift hospital was so large that soldiers had to keep order. Inside, the German doctors were weeping openly. One, his voice shaking, whispered to an American captain, "We lost the war, but perhaps humanity has won." The captain handed him a vial and said quietly, "We're all fighting the same enemy now: death." Dr. Karl Brenner, released from his POW camp that same year, returned to a homeland he barely recognized. The city of Hamburg was a skeleton, streets of ash, families searching through rubble. He found what was left of his old hospital. The roof gone, the wards flooded, the operating tables rusted by rain. For a moment, he thought his life's work had ended. Then he reached into his coat pocket. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a single ampule of penicillin. He'd carried it with him since the day the British doctor had let him use it on a dying man. It was empty now, but he kept it as a relic, a reminder of what medicine could be when wielded with compassion instead of power. He vowed to rebuild, not just the hospital, but the idea of medicine itself. In the months that followed, Brenner and other returning physicians organized makeshift clinics across northern Germany. They called themselves Die Ärzte ohne Fahne, the doctors without a flag. They didn't care who the patients were: German, Polish, Allied, displaced refugees. They treated them all. They wrote to the Allied authorities, begging for supplies. When crates of penicillin arrived by train under U.S. Army supervision, Brenner held one in his hands like a sacred object. The first child they saved was a 7-year-old girl named Marta, dying of bacterial pneumonia. She had been turned away from 3 hospitals, all out of medicine. Brenner administered the new drug, diluted, rationed, desperate. Within 48 hours, her fever broke. Within a week, she was sitting up, eating soup. Her mother fell to her knees, sobbing, "You brought her back from the dead." Brenner only shook his head. "No, madam. The world brought her back." Soon, news spread across Germany. The Americans were sending a cure. Lines formed outside every clinic, stretching for blocks. For many Germans, penicillin became their first direct encounter with Allied mercy, a tangible sign that the victors hadn't come only to punish, but to heal. The psychological effect was profound. Decades of propaganda about inhuman enemies crumbled in the face of a single injection that saved a child's life. A nurse in Bremen described it perfectly. We had lost faith in everything. In God, in leaders, in ourselves. But when we saw people who had every reason to hate us still bringing us medicine, something broke inside us, and something new began to grow. Meanwhile, American and British officials realized they had stumbled upon something extraordinary. Not just a humanitarian mission, but a geopolitical one. They began using penicillin as part of Reconstruction diplomacy, sending supplies not only to Germany but to Italy, France, and Japan. It was the Marshall Plan before the Marshall Plan. Healing as soft power. A U.S. Army memo from 1946 read, "Every cured child is a victory for democracy. Every infection stopped is a barrier against bitterness." For the German doctors, though, the lesson ran even deeper. They had lived through an era when medicine had been twisted by ideology, when healing was replaced by eugenics, and hospitals became instruments of cruelty. Now they were witnessing its redemption. Brenner's new hospital, built from salvaged bricks and Allied donations, hung a wooden sign above its entrance that read, "Zum Leben, nicht zum Sieg." For life, not for victory. It became a mantra. Patients from every background came through its doors. Children with infected wounds, farmers with abscesses, elderly women with bronchitis. And for all of them, penicillin worked its quiet miracle. In a single year, mortality rates from infection in the region dropped by 60%. For the first time in his career, Brenner wasn't losing patients faster than he could save them, and each life he saved felt like one small step toward repaying the moral debt his generation had created. When American physicians visited in 1947, they were astonished by how quickly the German doctors had adapted. They found Brenner in his white coat, surrounded by former POWs turned medical teachers, giving lectures on antibiotic therapy to rooms full of students. On the wall behind him was a large poster, hand-painted and slightly crooked, showing a vial of penicillin encircled by the words, "Science has no enemies." He smiled when he saw the visitors watching. "You see," he said, "you defeated us once with this. Now we will use it to defeat suffering." The American doctor replied softly, "That's the only kind of victory worth keeping." By 1948, penicillin had become widely available across Europe. Factories in the UK and US shared their fermentation secrets with German chemists, who refined the process and created their own production lines in Frankfurt and Munich. For the first time in years, the word German science began to mean something good again. And in a twist of poetic justice, many of those who had once studied penicillin as prisoners were now leading its manufacture, turning their wartime humiliation into post-war redemption. By the late 1940s, a quiet revolution was underway, not on battlefields or in parliaments, but in hospitals and laboratories across the world. What had begun as a military secret was now transforming the entire fabric of human life. Penicillin, once measured in drops and guarded like gold, was spreading to every corner of civilization. The age of antibiotics had begun. In post-war America, factories that once forged bomb casings were now filled with steel fermentation vats. Trains that had hauled tanks across the continent now carried refrigerated crates of medicine. The war machine had been repurposed for healing. By 1949, the United States was producing enough penicillin to treat every infected person on Earth, a sentence that would have sounded impossible just 5 years earlier. What the world had witnessed in those few years wasn't just a medical breakthrough, it was the redirection of human genius, from destruction to preservation. Meanwhile, across Europe, the healing continued. In Poland, French and German cities still pocked with craters, mobile clinics roamed from town to town. Doctors, many of them former soldiers, worked under tarpaulins and half-collapsed roofs. Everywhere they went, people lined up for the same injection that had once been reserved for Allied officers. It became a symbol of a new kind of equality, one where suffering, not nationality, determined who received care. Dr. Karl Brenner's hospital in Hamburg became part of this movement. He and his small team treated over 10,000 patients in the first 2 years, distributing penicillin to smaller rural clinics and refugee centers. For many of those patients, it was their first encounter with modern medicine. A farmer from Schleswig once told him, tears streaming down his face, "Doctor, we lost everything, but we did not lose compassion." At the same time, scientists were learning just how powerful and delicate this new tool was. The medical journals of 1947 and 1948 read like dispatches from a new frontier. Doctors reported miraculous recoveries, pneumonia cases cured overnight, blood poisoning reversed, childbirth infections halted before tragedy struck. But they also began to see a troubling pattern: bacteria that learned to fight back. A few stubborn strains no longer responded to penicillin as expected. Fleming himself, the man who discovered it, warned the world in a BBC radio address. The misuse of penicillin will one day lead to resistant bacteria. Then, instead of saving lives, it may no longer work at all. Few listened. For now, the miracles were too dazzling to question. In Germany, Brenner taught his students a different lesson. He had seen what happened when power went unchecked, whether in politics or science. So in every lecture, he ended with the same words: "No drug is invincible. No man is infallible. Science must always remember its soul." He would tell them stories of Normandy, of the camps, of how he first saw the miracle through the hands of his captors. And every time, the students fell silent. It wasn't just a medical history lesson, it was a moral one. The spread of penicillin soon transcended continents. In 1948, the newly formed World Health Organization made antibiotics a global priority. Shipments were sent to India, Egypt, and China, places still ravaged by typhoid, dysentery, and maternal infections. Everywhere it arrived, life expectancy rose. Infant mortality dropped. Wars that once left entire populations crippled by disease were followed by rapid recovery. A journalist for Time magazine wrote in 1949, "The greatest victory of the 20th century may not have been won by armies, but by a mold spore." For the former German doctors who had once seen it as their enemy's advantage, this truth was deeply humbling. In 1950, Brenner was invited to London to attend a symposium on antibiotic research. There, sitting beside British and American scientists, he realized something extraordinary. There was no longer a them and us. They were colleagues again. When asked to speak, he stood slowly and said, "I came here once as a prisoner. Now I return as a student. Penicillin did not just cure our infections. It cured our arrogance." His words earned a standing ovation. It wasn't about nationalism anymore. It was about shared humanity, rediscovering its conscience. By the 1950s, other antibiotics followed: streptomycin, chloramphenicol, tetracycline, each one pushing the boundary further. But penicillin remained the symbol, the origin, the proof that healing could be stronger than hate. Even governments noticed. Where tanks had once rolled, medical convoys now traveled. Where borders had been drawn in blood, they were crossed by Red Cross nurses carrying crates stamped with a blue cross and the word penicillin. For the first time in history, medicine had become not a privilege of nations, but a right of mankind. Back in Hamburg, Brenner's little hospital became a teaching center, a place where Allied and German doctors trained side by side. One day, a British officer who had worked with the penicillin project visited. He was older now, slower, but his voice carried warmth. As he watched Brenner's students perform a demonstration, he smiled and said, "You've built something beautiful here, Doctor." Brenner replied softly, "We just followed the mold." They both laughed, and for a moment, the ghosts of the war seemed to fade. But perhaps the most powerful proof of penicillin's impact wasn't in hospitals at all. It was in homes. Across the world, mothers who would once have buried their children were now watching them grow up. Fathers who had survived battlefield infections were holding their babies for the first time. Entire generations were living simply because a forgotten Petri dish in a London lab had been left unwashed. One newspaper headline said it best: "The weapon that ended war by ending death." And yet, beneath the triumph, Brenner understood something profound. Science alone couldn't save humanity. Only the heart guiding it could. Because the same mind that made penicillin could also make poison. The same hands that saved lives could still destroy them. That was the dual legacy of the 20th century. And perhaps, he thought, that was why the discovery of penicillin mattered so deeply, not just as a medicine, but as a moral compass. The world remembered the soldiers, the generals, the treaties, but almost no one remembered the doctors, the men who had walked into captivity with blood still on their hands, only to emerge with something purer: understanding. By the early 1950s, most of the captured German physicians who had witnessed penicillin for the first time were back in civilian life. Their uniforms were gone, their ranks erased. But in every hospital they joined, they carried a quiet mission: to rebuild the moral soul of medicine. Dr. Karl Brenner was one of them. So was Otto Schreiber, who took a post in Munich's University Hospital, and Heinrich Falk, who joined the new medical faculty in Stuttgart. They were no longer instruments of an empire. They were teachers now, the unlikely apostles of a mold that had shown them the limits of power. When the war ended, Germany's medical community was in ruins. Not just its buildings, but its reputation. The Nuremberg doctors' trials had exposed horrors that made the world recoil: human experimentation, sterilization, euthanasia. For every scientist who had pursued knowledge, another had pursued cruelty in the name of ideology. Rebuilding trust seemed impossible, but it began quietly, with the men who had seen what true medicine looked like behind enemy lines. In 1947, Brenner testified at a denazification hearing. When asked how he had spent the last year of the war, he replied, "I learned humility in an English laboratory. I watched enemies save my countrymen with a medicine we called impossible." The tribunal cleared him, noting that his conduct demonstrated a sincere devotion to the preservation of life. That single sentence opened a door, not just for him, but for dozens of former POW doctors who would go on to reshape post-war medicine. They became the backbone of Germany's new medical ethics. They wrote new textbooks, revising every line that had once justified cruelty in the name of science. They taught their students not only anatomy and pathology, but morality. At the University of Hamburg, Brenner introduced a course called The Responsibility of the Physician. Its opening lecture began not with Latin terminology or case studies, but with a single story: the day he first saw penicillin save a life. He told it the same way each year: the tent hospital, the fever, the injection, the awakening. And always, he ended with the same words: science cannot belong to nations. It must belong to the living. His students, most too young to remember the war, listened as if hearing a confession. To them, the past was a warning, and the drug that once symbolized defeat had become their emblem of redemption. In the 1950s, these same doctors helped found the German Medical Association for Ethics and Human Research, modeled after the Allied codes introduced in Nuremberg. They drafted new rules for experimentation, consent, and patient rights, the foundation of modern bioethics. When penicillin began being used in medical studies on tuberculosis, rheumatic fever, and meningitis, these former POWs were among the first to advocate for ethical oversight. Dr. Schreiber once said at a symposium in Bonn, "When we saw penicillin in Allied hospitals, We saw that knowledge used rightly can redeem a world. When used wrongly, it can destroy one. The choice is ours every day. His words were reprinted in Der Spiegel, marking the beginning of a new national dialogue, one that replaced secrecy with transparency, arrogance with accountability. For the Allies who had once imprisoned them, these transformations didn't go unnoticed. In 1955, the British Medical Council invited a small delegation of German physicians to Oxford to visit the birthplace of penicillin. Among them was Brenner. He stood quietly in Fleming's old laboratory, now preserved as a museum, gazing at the dusty Petri dish, where the discovery had begun. An English guide approached and said softly, "Strange, isn't it? Such a small accident changed the world." Brenner nodded. "Yes," he said, "and changed us." He later wrote in his notes, "We came here once as conquerors. We left as caretakers. Back in Germany, their influence spread. Hospitals began adopting a new motto, Heilen ohne Hass, heal without hate. It was painted on the walls of clinics rebuilt with Allied aid. Young doctors carried pocket guides explaining antibiotic use and ethical care. The change wasn't dramatic, but it was steady. The quiet correction of an entire generation's soul. By 1960, penicillin was so common in German hospitals that even rural doctors had it on their shelves. Yet for those who had first seen it as prisoners, every vial still carried a whisper of awe. One evening, Brenner found himself treating a British tourist who'd fallen ill in Hamburg. When the man recognized his accent and realized he was being treated by a former Wehrmacht doctor, he hesitated. But Brenner only smiled and said, "Don't worry, sir. This medicine doesn't take sides," the man laughed. And in that laughter, two worlds briefly reconciled. In 1963, Brenner attended the inauguration of the new World Health Organization Antibiotic Research Council in Geneva. He sat beside physicians from nations that had once been enemies: Japan, Britain, France, the United States. As he listened to the opening speech, he realized something profound. The global fight against disease had replaced the war of nations. The Council's first declaration read, "Health is not the property of states. It is the inheritance of humanity." Brenner felt a quiet satisfaction. It was the same idea he had scribbled into his POW notebook nearly 20 years earlier. The same truth that penicillin had taught him in a cold English lab. When he returned home, he placed that old, empty ampule of penicillin on his desk. Its label had faded, its glass slightly yellowed, but to him, it remained the symbol of everything that mattered. He wrote one last entry in his journal that night. "We were captured by men, but freed by science. And through its mercy, we became human again. The world would never know their names. But in every hospital that used antibiotics ethically, in every patient saved without prejudice, the legacy of those forgotten prisoners lived on. Their redemption wasn't carved in monuments. It was written in survival." By the 1970s, the miracle that began in a forgotten Petri dish had become so common it was almost invisible. Penicillin no longer made headlines. It sat quietly on pharmacy shelves, a background miracle, one that had saved more lives than all the surgeons and generals in history combined. But to those who remembered its beginning, to the men who had first seen it in the war, to the prisoners who had learned humility through healing, it remained something sacred. Not a chemical, but a covenant. Dr. Karl Brenner's hospital in Hamburg was now a teaching institution, filled with young interns who knew antibiotics only as routine. One afternoon, a medical student burst into his office, waving a newspaper. "Professor," he said excitedly, "they've discovered bacteria that no longer respond to penicillin." Brenner took the paper, read the headline, and nodded slowly. "Yes," he said softly, "the medicine that once humbled humanity will now test it again." He looked out the window at the rebuilt skyline, cranes, hospitals, new glass towers rising where the ruins had been. "We learned once what happens when we believe we are gods," he said. "Let us not forget it again." The student didn't fully understand then, but years later, he would. The rise of antibiotic resistance was more than a scientific warning. It was a moral echo. Every misused prescription, every over-treated infection, was a reminder that arrogance could destroy even the greatest gift. Scientists began tracing the parallels. They saw how, in the 1940s, nations had abused power and paid in blood. Now, humanity was abusing discovery, and might pay in disease. The lesson of penicillin was repeating itself. That progress without restraint, victory without humility, always carried a cost. But the legacy of the mold wasn't just a cautionary tale. It was also a blueprint for how humanity could rise again, through cooperation, through science shared freely rather than hoarded. When new antibiotics were developed, streptomycin, erythromycin, vancomycin, they followed the same spirit of openness. No patents in wartime, no borders in healing. It became an unspoken code among researchers that medicine was not a weapon, but a responsibility. At global medical conferences, the phrase penicillin diplomacy began to appear, a term for how nations once at war now shared cures instead of threats. The Cold War was at its height, but scientists from Washington and Moscow still exchanged antibiotic samples. In a world divided by ideology, penicillin had created a bridge that neither bomb nor treaty could destroy. In Germany, Brenner's story became something of a legend, not official history, but whispered between doctors, told in classrooms. The doctor who found redemption through a drug. He never liked the attention. He insisted he had only been a witness, not a hero. Still, his lectures grew famous across Europe. He would begin every talk with the same sentence. In the end, medicine will not be judged by how many diseases it cured, but by how many souls it healed. Then he would show a faded black-and-white photograph of a war hospital, the first time he saw penicillin used. He never said where it was taken, but his audience always fell silent. When Brenner died in 1975, the international medical community sent condolences from every continent. The World Health Organization honored him posthumously with a plaque that read, "For reminding the world that healing is humanity's highest calling." Among his belongings, his family found that same empty ampule of penicillin. Inside his diary was one final note, written in his shaky hand. "Perhaps we did not deserve it, but we were given it anyway. That is what grace means." Outside the realm of medicine, the ripple of penicillin continued in unexpected ways. Philosophers, historians, and ethicists began writing about it, not as a scientific event, but as a moral pivot. They called it the day science learned empathy. It had shown humanity that progress could serve mercy, not domination. That compassion could travel faster than conquest. That a discovery made for saving soldiers could end up saving enemies. And, perhaps most importantly, that every invention carried a reflection of its maker's heart. By the end of the century, penicillin had saved an estimated 200 million lives. Its descendants, other antibiotics, would save billions more. But each of those miracles carried a trace of that first encounter. A British Petri dish, a German prisoner, a battlefield infection, a moment where enemies stopped being enemies and became doctors again. When historians asked what made the 20th century both its darkest and most enlightened age, one answer always surfaced. We learned to destroy completely, and then we learned to heal completely. The mold that grew by accident on a London dish became the seed of something divine. Proof that even in the ruins of war, life could still find a way to mend itself. In 1999, at a medical museum in Geneva, a display was unveiled titled Penicillin, the Medicine That Ended War. At its center sat a small, cracked glass ampule labeled in faded ink, Pfizer, 1944. Below it, engraved in brass, were 6 words that summed up a century of redemption. From mercy came victory. For all. And so, the legacy of the mold lived on. Not in laboratories, not in museums, but in every act of care, every life saved, every hand that reached out to heal without asking who the patient was. It taught the world that the truest triumph of science isn't invention, it's forgiveness.